Welcome back to English Convo, where we explore practical ways to master the English language. I'm your host, Kate, and I'm incredibly excited about today's episode. We're diving deep into something that many of our listeners have been asking about: how to improve your English fluency. Joining me today is someone who has helped thousands of English learners break through their speaking barriers and achieve true fluency. Please welcome Kevin, renowned language learning expert who has developed innovative methods for mastering English conversation. Kevin, it's wonderful to have you on the show.
Thank you, Kate. I'm delighted to be here and excited to share some practical strategies with your listeners.
Today, we'll be exploring actionable techniques that our listeners can start using right away to boost their English speaking confidence and fluency. Kevin will be sharing his expertise and giving us insights into what really works when it comes to mastering English conversation. Kevin, before we dive into the specific techniques, I'd love to hear about your own language learning journey. What inspired you to become so passionate about helping others with their English fluency?
Well, Kate, my journey actually started when I was struggling to learn Spanish during my college years. I was using traditional methods, textbooks, classroom learning, and standard exercises, but I just wasn't making the progress I wanted. This experience really opened my eyes to how challenging language learning can be. I remember feeling frustrated and stuck, especially when trying to speak spontaneously. It was this personal struggle that led me to explore different learning approaches and ultimately revolutionized how I viewed language acquisition.
That's fascinating. How did you transition from being a language learner yourself to helping others with English?
After mastering Spanish, I realized that the techniques I developed could be applied to any language. I started informally helping international students with their English, and the results were incredible. They were making breakthroughs in their fluency much faster than through traditional methods. What really motivated me was seeing the transformation in people's lives. When someone becomes fluent in English, it's not just about language. It opens up new career opportunities, helps them build meaningful relationships, and gives them a whole new level of confidence.
That's really powerful. What would you say was the biggest lesson from your own learning experience?
The biggest lesson was that traditional language learning often focuses too much on perfection and not enough on practical communication. I learned that making mistakes is actually a crucial part of the learning process. This realization completely changed my approach to teaching and is now a cornerstone of my methodology.
Let's talk about practical techniques our listeners can start using today. What daily habits would you recommend for someone who wants to improve their English fluency?
The most important thing is to make English a part of your daily life, Kate. Start by changing your phone's language settings to English. This forces you to interact with English in a practical, everyday way.
That's such a simple but effective tip. What other immersion techniques do you recommend?
I always tell my students to create an English bubble around themselves. Listen to English podcasts during your commute. Watch Netflix shows in English with English subtitles, and read English news articles during your coffee break. The key is consistency rather than long study sessions.
What about speaking practice? That's often the biggest challenge for learners.
Absolutely. Speaking is crucial, and here's what I recommend. Spend at least 10 minutes every day talking to yourself in English. It might sound strange, but narrate your morning routine, describe what you're cooking, or explain your workday to an imaginary friend.
That's fascinating. And it's something anyone can do, regardless of their circumstances.
Exactly. Another powerful technique is what I call the shadow and repeat method. Choose a short video or audio clip of a native speaker. Listen to a sentence, pause, and repeat it exactly as you heard it. Focus on matching the intonation and rhythm.
And how often should listeners practice these exercises?
Consistency is more important than duration. 15 minutes of daily practice is far more effective than 3 hours once a week. I also encourage learners to record themselves speaking and listen back to track their progress. It's amazing how much you can improve when you're aware of your own speech patterns.
Now, Kevin, I'm sure our listeners encounter various challenges when working on their fluency. What are some common roadblocks you see in your students?
The biggest roadblock I consistently see is the fear of making mistakes, Kate. Many learners get stuck in this perfectionist mindset where they won't speak unless they're absolutely certain everything is grammatically correct.
That's so true. How do you help students overcome this fear?
I remind them that even native speakers make mistakes all the time. The key is to embrace these mistakes as learning opportunities. I always tell my students, it's better to speak with mistakes than not to speak at all.
What other common challenges do learners face?
Another major roadblock is what I call the translation trap, when learners try to translate everything from their native language to English in their head before speaking. This creates those awkward pauses that interrupt fluency.
How can they break free from this habit?
The solution is to think in English directly. Start with simple things. When you see a dog, don't think pero and then translate to dog. Just think dog. It takes practice, but it's transformative for fluency.
Are there any other significant obstacles you've noticed?
Yes, many learners struggle with what I call vocabulary paralysis. They freeze up when they can't find the exact word they want to use. The solution here is to develop circumlocution skills, being able to explain things in different ways.
Could you give our listeners an example of that?
Sure, if you can't remember the word screwdriver, you could say the tool you use to tighten screws. It keeps the conversation flowing and actually helps you learn new vocabulary and context. The goal is to keep talking, even when you don't know every word.
Speaking of keeping the conversation flowing, let's talk about technology. There are so many apps and tools available now for language learners. What are some of your favorite resources, Kevin?
Absolutely, Kate. We're really fortunate to live in an age where technology makes language learning so accessible. One of my top recommendations is language exchange apps, where you can practice with native speakers from around the world.
And these apps are specifically designed for language learning, right?
Exactly. They include features like text correction and voice messages, which are incredibly helpful. But I also recommend more general apps like Netflix and YouTube, which are gold mines for authentic English content.
How do you suggest learners use these platforms effectively?
I always recommend starting with English subtitles on, then gradually transitioning to watching without them. And here's a pro tip. Use the playback speed feature. Start slower if needed, then work your way up to normal speed.
That's brilliant. Are there any specific websites you'd recommend for more structured learning?
Yes, definitely. Websites like LinkU are great for reading and listening practice, while Forvo helps with pronunciation. I also love how Youglish shows you how words are used in real context through YouTube videos.
What about tools for practicing speaking when you don't have a conversation partner?
There are some amazing AI-powered apps now, like ELSA Speak for pronunciation practice and Language AI for simulated conversations. But my favorite simple technique is using voice recording apps to record yourself speaking, then listening back to identify areas for improvement.
Those are great suggestions. Are there any tools specifically for vocabulary building?
Absolutely. Anki is fantastic for spaced repetition flashcards. And don't forget about good old podcast apps. Listening to English podcasts like this one is incredibly valuable. I always tell my students to find podcasts about topics they're genuinely interested in.
Now, Kevin, we've covered a lot of practical tools and techniques, but let's talk about something equally important: staying motivated. How do you help your students maintain their enthusiasm when learning gets challenging?
That's such a crucial topic, Kate. I always tell my students that motivation isn't something that just happens to you. It's something you cultivate. The key is setting realistic, achievable goals. Instead of saying, I want to be fluent, try, I want to have a 5-minute conversation about my hobbies without hesitating.
That makes so much sense. Breaking it down into smaller goals must feel less overwhelming.
Exactly. And I encourage everyone to celebrate these small wins. Did you successfully order coffee in English? That's a win. Did you understand a joke in an English TV show? That's progress. These little victories add up and keep you going.
What about those days when motivation is really low? We all have them.
Those days are totally normal. One strategy one recommend is having an accountability buddy, someone who's also learning English. You can check in with each other, practice together, and keep each other motivated. It's also helpful to connect your English learning to something you're passionate about.
Could you give us an example of that?
Sure, if you love cooking, try following English recipe videos. If you're into gaming, play games in English, and join English-speaking gaming communities. When you combine learning with something you already enjoy, it becomes less of a chore and more of a hobby.
Those are fantastic suggestions. Any final tips for maintaining long-term motivation?
Yes, track your progress. Keep a language learning journal or record yourself speaking English every month. When you feel discouraged, look back at where you started. You'll be amazed at how far you've come, and that's incredibly motivating.
Well, Kevin, this has been such an enlightening conversation. Before we wrap up, could you help me summarize the key takeaways for our listeners who want to improve their English fluency?
Of course, Kate, the most important thing to remember is that becoming fluent in English is a journey, not a destination. Start with daily practice, even if it's just 15 minutes. Remember those immersion techniques we discussed: watching English content, using language learning apps, and finding conversation partners.
And we talked about those common roadblocks and how to overcome them. What would you say is the single most important piece of advice for our listeners?
I'd say it's to not be afraid of making mistakes. They're not failures, they're stepping stones to fluency. Practice speaking as much as you can, use the technology and resources available to you, and most importantly, stay consistent with your learning routine.
That's fantastic advice. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today, Kevin. You've given our listeners so many practical tools they can start using right away.
Thank you for having me, Kate. And to all the listeners out there, remember that every expert was once a beginner. Take it one step at a time, and you'll be amazed at your progress.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode of English Convo. If you enjoyed this discussion, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and leave us a review. Join us next week for another exciting episode about language learning. Until then, keep practicing and stay motivated.